Welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Rochester. For more than 150 years, ours has been a church striving to have open minds and loving hearts, celebrating many sources of wisdom and many spiritual paths. Your faith, your doubts, your questions, your hopes for our world are welcome here. Our doors are closed because our hearts are open, living our values of care and compassion. You can stay connected online through Coffee Hour, a racial justice book series, chalice circles for monthly reflection. Families and children can pick up spirit kits curbside here to bring home. You can join us every Wednesday night as well for online Wednesday forums. This Wednesday, I'll be hosting an election vigil gathering. Come with poetry or readings, music or stories, or just come with your heart, with your soul, shoring up our hope as we enter this coming week, this precarious election. Join us online this Wednesday at 6:30 in the evening. And today we begin our annual auction, online in a virtual way, of course, this year. Online bidding begins today at 12 o'clock noon. It goes through Thursday evening, and then there's a live event Friday evening at 7. See the special auction e-news we sent out this past Friday, or visit our website to help support our church. And each year we support a community partner as part of our auction, which this year is for Project Legacy. So you can start bidding now and bid often, bid all week, and see you Friday night at 7 o'clock for our live event. And as we honor All Souls Sunday next week, we invite you this week to send in names or photos of loved ones that you've lost in the last year to be part of our online service. And then after the service, our memorial garden here at church will be open from 10 to 5 p.m., where you can honor the memory of ancestors. There'll be a small altar, candles to light. Find details in your e-news. And thank you to service participants today, Stephanie Evans Hanson and Alex Higano, offering reflections on our monthly theme of deep listening in their work as school counselors in Rochester, and to guest musician Vonna Morales, pianist, singer, and teacher here in Rochester. Thank you for offering your gifts of music today. Today's offering goes to support our church, its mission and programs, as well as our Human Needs Fund, which offers financial emergency assistance to members and friends. You can give at uurochmn.org. Thanks for your generosity. And in the words of the Reverend Eliza Tupper Wilkes, minister of this church in the 1870s, may our faith in humanity and our message of hope and good cheer light our way. It's good to be together.
This is the Unitarian Universalist Church. This is the Church of the Flaming Chalice. This is the Church of the Open Minds. This is the Church of the Loving Hearts, where we friends come to share. Good. We're lighting the chalice. Look.
The way that I introduce my role as an elementary school counselor to my students is by using a block analogy. I tell a story of mishaps and big worries, all while stacking cardboard, multi-sized and multicolored blocks into the school social worker's hands. For instance, let's imagine that I say, let's pretend that she is worried because she didn't finish her homework last night because the internet crashed. And then I place the first block into her hands. And then all of those worries made it really hard to sleep, so she woke up late. And that's another block. Because she was kind of worried and she was kind of shaky in the morning, she spilled orange juice all over her shirt and had to change. Block. And that extra time caused her to miss her bus. Block. And when she finally got to school, she realized that she forgot her mask. Block. So now she's tired. Block. Hungry. Block. Embarrassed and really worried. Block. So she goes to talk to her best friend. But her best friend's not talking with her, and she doesn't know why. Block. Now, as you can imagine, the blocks have piled high into the school social worker's hands, and to punctuate just how much is being carried and how awkwardly balanced, I then say, now, without putting any of those blocks down, I need you to take a math test. Can you do it? 2020 seems to be a year that just keeps piling on the blocks. And with all the different blocks that we all carry, it can be hard to focus, hard to feel comfortable or at peace in our own bodies, and hard to go about daily routines. In other words, it can be really hard to carry all of those blocks on our own. So that's why, with my students, to close that block analogy, I introduced the idea of how I, as the school counselor, as well as the school social worker, are people at school that can take some of the blocks, which I then do, by deeply listening, by sitting with students, and by working together with students to try to find a way to feel better to be at school. And ideally, empowering the student to learn strategies that make them feel better outside of school too. As you can imagine, like everything, school counseling, it looks different this year. I spend the majority of my time in front of screens, whether it be recording lessons, talking with a student on a Google Meet, talking to puppets by myself, endless emails, or making a Google slideshow. I'm still able to have a student in my office, but with the now standard social distancing and the sanitizing routines. But regardless of whether in person or over a Google Meet, deep listening remains as significant as ever, probably even more significant. And I'm not just referring to trying to understand a little kid voice through a masked, muffled voice, but that too. I'm mainly referring to the sense of belonging and community that the students, that we all seem to be constantly seeking right now. In this time of staying distanced, in this time of missed trips and vacations, and yes, even in this time of feeling nationally divided. Having a loving, non-judgmental space for their voice and having it be received by compassion. And sometimes that compassion comes with stillness, and other times that compassion comes with a megaphone to make their voice louder. Either way, that's the gift that deep listening can give. In choosing to become an elementary school counselor, I feel that I'm able to live my Unitarian Universalist values on a daily basis. And for me, that's important, but the career counselor in me would be remiss to say that all careers or all jobs must also align that way. Because living our values, like gifting deep listening, that's something that every person can do in any capacity, in any role, or at any age. And I truly believe that if we practiced listening more deeply, hearing the emotions with the words, giving space for another person's story, even if that story is not like our own, that can allow for bridges to be built, establishing relationships and deep connections that can then allow for conversations where we may need to hold each other accountable. but mostly, deeply listening can allow for a strengthened sense of belonging and a sense that we can work together to make a place that is welcoming, comfortable, and a space that cultivates love. In other words, we can strengthen our community by offering to hold each other's blocks.
About, I don't know, 30 years ago, when I was a freshman in high school, one of my teachers said something that has lasted, I still remember it like it was yesterday. It was in response to something I had said. I'm assuming we were talking about, I don't know, something like South America or Africa or something where at the time my response was, well, we are civilized and they are not. Well, the response from my teacher, the one that still sticks with me today, is that's not right. They are just civilized in a different way than we are. People all over the world wouldn't be where they are today without some semblance of civilization. This was really impactful for me because it brought to mind the fact that she's right. Although people do things differently and in a different manner than we individually do, doesn't mean that it's inherently wrong or bad. It just means that it's, different. So today's story talks a little bit about those differences, but really it reflects a little bit more on what we all have that's actually the same. Whoever You Are by Mem Fox, illustrated by Leslie Staub. Little one, whoever you are, wherever you are, there are little ones just like you all over this world. Their skin may be different from yours. Their home may be different from yours. Their school may be different from yours. And their lands may be different from yours. Their lives may be different from yours. And their words, they may be very different from yours. But inside, their hearts are just like yours. Wherever they are, whoever they are, all over the world. Their smiles are like yours, and they laugh just like you. Their hurts are like yours, and they cry like you too. Whoever they are, wherever they are, all over the world. Little one, when you are older and when you are grown, you may be different. And they may be different. Wherever you are, wherever they are, in this big, wide world. But remember this. We all have joys. We all have love. We all have pain. And the blood that runs in us is the same. The smiles are the same, and our hearts are the same. Wherever they are, wherever you are, wherever we are, all over the world. All of these differences, this rainbow of skin color and eye color and hair color and customs and religions and beliefs, well, that's what makes us all so special in our unique ways. Sure, are there things we disagree with? Yeah, I mean, that's going to happen no matter where you are. But it is these differences that make the world beautiful and so exciting to go around and explore and learn more things about. So remember that. Even if there's a difference that you're not quite in agreement with, it's what makes us the same on the inside and our ability to relate to one another that makes this world the amazing place it is.
Good morning, fellow UU friends. My name is Alex Higano, and I would like to share with you my perspective as a licensed school counselor. I have been a school counselor for 7 years now. I started my career working for a virtual high school in 2014, moved to a culturally East African American school in Minneapolis Public Schools, and now for the last 4 years have been working at Mayo High School here in Rochester, where, as many of you know, we have been in a distance learning model since March due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In some ways, I feel like I've come full circle since working at that intentionally virtual high school at the beginning of my career. One of the best and most unique aspects of being a school counselor and being in education more generally is that we get to see all different groups of people and all different diverse identities represented in our community. It really is a privilege to listen to and speak with people from across racial identities, economic tiers, gender identities, and so many more identities, different personalities, and social groups. There are many students and staff who share divergent values, political beliefs, life experiences, and various different coping strategies for managing the challenges of our times. I believe that working with so many different types of people is a privilege because the humanity we have in our community is rich. and no person is excluded from that. I want to particularly highlight that I am privileged in my role because so many of our social networks and governing structures these days have become fragmented, polarized, and isolated from one another. In my role, I get to work across these boundaries, across these fragmented barriers. This state of a polarized community is not natural, and we must fight against this fragmentation by being very intentional, both in our use of social media and in our regular conversations with one another. As a school counselor, I strive to hear the humanity in each person's story, knowing that they have come to where they are through their own lived experiences. I try to lift up voices who are not often heard, and I actively listen in for the emotions and unstated traumas experienced by those whose voices are hardened in their perspectives. I wish I could tell you so many stories of many conversations with students and families when I have witnessed hardened voices soften when they realize I'm just there to listen to them and to hear them. These experiences as a school counselor lead me to believe that there are so many people more broadly in our world who have felt chronically unheard, misheard, or actively silenced repeatedly. Sometimes we hear the term mental health and we think of the individual struggle, but we don't so often think of how the community's ability to lift up those who need to be heard can be a healing force for many. When we feel heard, we feel included, we feel visible, and we feel that we are in community with others. I want to acknowledge that listening in this way is difficult, and this takes practice. When I return to school every August, I sometimes feel like a weightlifter who has taken a break from the weight room. This takes some effort to get back into the groove. I also want to acknowledge that it is incumbent on those of us who do carry more privilege to be the ones doing the heavy lifting, not to speak for those unheard voices, but to clear some space for those voices that we need to hear most. Thank you all for hearing my voice today, and I am grateful to you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you in our service.
I invite you to take a moment to pause. Take an easy breath. Breathe deep the breath of life. Know that here in this house you are named, you are known as beloved. Find your center. Feel below you the earth and its ancient turning. Feel above you the sky and the stars with their ancient light, holding you here between right now. I invite you into this time of meditation, this time of prayer, first by sharing silence together. Spirit of life and source of love, God of 1,000 names and beyond all names, the blocks just keep piling on, it seems. And some days it really seems they're just falling right out of our uncertain and shaking hands and hearts. Not sure what to set down, not sure how, if we even can hold it all, how to keep moving forward. Sometimes it sure seems like it's fallen apart, but yet we move forward. We rise to the day. May we remember, even in those days of staying apart, which are now, to not go it alone. To know we need not, should not, cannot hold it all on our own, but together. Each of us telling our own stories, each of us listening to the stories of others, we can hold the wider truth that makes up our humanity. And in that large tent of all souls, may we be held. And we hold all those who are suffering in mind, in body, in spirit. I invite you to bring the names you're holding in your own heart this day in joy or in sorrow, celebration or concern, and silently or aloud now in this sacred hour to speak their names. For all those names, spoken and unspoken, may we be forever grateful for the fabric of love and of life that weaves us together. May those threads hold us in love and in strength. These words of meditation come from Mary Oliver. That time, I thought I could not go any closer to grief without dying. I went closer, and I did not die. Surely God had his hand in this as well as friends. Still I was bent, and my laughter, as the poet said, was nowhere to be found. Then said my friend Daniel, brave even among lions, "It's not the weight you carry, but how you carry it. Books, bricks, grief. It's all the way you embrace it, balance, carry it when you cannot and would not put it down." So I went practicing, she writes. Have you noticed? Have you heard the laughter that comes now and again out of my startled mouth? How I lingered to admire the things of this world that are kind and maybe also troubled. Roses in the wind, the sea geese on the steep waves, a love to which there is no reply. Amen.
The first reading is Why There Will Always Be Thistle by Maxine Kumin. Sheep will not eat it, nor horses, nor cattle, unless they are starving. Unchecked, it will sprawl over pasture and meadow, choking the sweetgrass, defeating the clover, until you are driven to take arms against it. But if unthinking, you grasp it bare-handed, you will need tweezers to pick out the stickers. Outlawed in most northern states of the Union, still it jumps borders. Its taproot runs deeper than underground rivers, and once it's been severed by bread knife or shovel, two popular methods employed by the desperate, the bits that remain will spring up like dragon's teeth, a field full of soldiers, their spines at the ready. Bright little bursts of chrome yellow explode from the thistle in autumn, when goldfinches gorge on the seeds of its flower. The ones left uneaten dry up and pop open, and parachutes carry their procreant power to disparate venues in each hemisphere, which is why there will always be thistle next year.
The second reading from a speech at the World Social Forum in Brazil by Indian author and activist Arundhati Roy. Our strategy should not only be to confront empire, but to lay siege to it, to deprive it of oxygen, to shame it, to mock it. With our art, our music, our literature, our stubbornness, our joy, our brilliance, our sheer relentlessness, and our ability to tell our own stories. Stories that are different from the ones that we're being brainwashed to believe. The corporate revolution will collapse if we refuse to buy what they are selling. Their ideas, their version of history, their wars, their weapons, their notion of inevitability. Remember this, we be many and they be few. They need us more than we need them. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing.
I can still remember the exact shelf it was on, if returned properly, there in the library at Monroe Elementary School. Through the doorway, to the left, past the little table over there with the globe on it, down on the right side, the very bottom shelf, just below the dusty sunlight through the windows at the top of the wall. 2 copies sometimes, but almost always just one, because I have always checked out the other one as often as I could. There on the shelf, The Polar Express. It was by far my favorite book as a child, and when it was recently made into a movie a few years back, my favorite way to read books, I was quite glad. I don't know how it started, my love of the images and the story, the magic that the words and the images held for me. It may have begun simply with a love of Christmas, one I particularly inherited from my grandmother, many of whose decorations will soon adorn our home in the coming season. But I went back to it again and again for its magic, for its familiarity, for the world it created for me. It was probably fitting that I skipped right past the globe on the table, holding the whole world, to go to the one spot, the familiar place, the familiar story, the tried and true story that I knew to be a place of comfort where I could dwell. Stories matter, writes Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Nigerian novelist, and especially known for her TED Talk about the danger of a single story. In that, she said, many stories matter. She said, stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. She said, stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story, she says, about any place, then we regain a kind of paradise. Now, the Polar Express isn't a bad story, but any story, especially those of the dominant culture, which it certainly is. When any story is believed to be the one, the only normative, fundamental story, well, that causes problems. It happens all the time, sometimes overt, hideous perpetuations of white supremacy or narratives of law and order or 1,000 other historic oppressions, and sometimes in covert ways, hiding beneath the surface. It's like the air we breathe. We can hardly realize sometimes or notice the stories that we tell as becoming what seems to us the only stories worth giving our attention. It has happened throughout history. Here, as we try to shore up our patriotism and civic duty to vote, right on land that is stolen, built by slaves, rooted not only in personal biases, but also doctrinal writings like the doctrine of discovery, allowing Christians finding land from indigenous peoples to seize it and claim it as their own. We live within these competing realities of trying to love and work for a country that has never been just or equal, constantly failing to live up to its expressed and written ideals, or a view that ancient, or at least old texts can somehow be void of change, that the intention of the framers of the Constitution were somehow inerrant, as if they were perfect, as if their conflicting values of praising freedom while owning people somehow wasn't part of the words and the way that they put their values on paper. Originalism can make an idol of one document, one story, and the perspectives of only a certain group of people, in this case, white men, which is often the case, that the world has long been in the clutches of. While I'm no scholar, I do know the Constitution itself has changed, especially during Reconstruction following the Civil War, with amendments to make at least a little more right what was certainly wrong. And heaven help us if we believed we have arrived now somehow, that we are done with our needed changes. We sure tell some tales, don't we? How often have we just kept going back to the same shelf, right past the globe, or right past the world? Who needs that? Of stories and histories and struggles and hopes, and find the story we know and just dwell there like a little idol on the bottom shelf. Not too long ago, a teacher of mine had us write down some truth of ours, or some value, or some word that resonated deeply with us, a truth about our life or our own story. So I wrote down, among many words, one word I wrote was home. So I thought about it, wrote it down. And then she said, all right, take your paper and hold it up and rip it in half. I was like, oh my gosh, this is intense. And then set it down, she said, and then write another truth. Well, now we knew what was going to happen, but we did it. We kept writing our truths, maybe each time a little more preciously, knowing its fragility. And throughout that process, it kept going, and then at the end, she had us paste it all together, or tape it all together into something that kind of looked like this, where you have home, and in the middle of that you have love, in the middle of that you have hope, in the middle of that you have family, and 1,000 other meanings and deeper meanings beneath the words. What she wanted us to remember was that our own story, our own truths are always expanding, always need to be broken open when we think we've got it figured out, or there's only one part of our identity or one part of our story that matters, that it's always expanding, widening. We sure tell some tales, don't we? This is true among religious liberals often, that we've arrived somehow at the most evolved, thoughtful religion, that we've been at the forefront of justice and change for centuries. And there too, that story needs to be broken open again and again. That while we can celebrate some work that we have done and good things we have showed up for in good relationship building ways, still part of our story we must know is that many of our religious founders owned people. They owned black people, slaves, and argued for it. That Eliza Tupper Wilkes, of which we should celebrate regularly, was an anomaly in our tradition that didn't really respect and hardly ever ordained women or people of color or LGBTQI people until at least the last 50, 40 years in any regularity. And that in this very church, a former minister in this pulpit, or at least the pulpit of this congregation, at the height of the eugenics movement, vocalized his support broadly and publicly for a science based on bigotry. And it's not easy to know all the stories and to dig to find those stories. It's not easy for the soul to be aware of it sometimes in a culture and a society that prefers to live by single stories. But we know that stories at their best break open wider and wider to the world. That we begin to notice both the contradictions and the connections if we're really paying attention, listening deeply. That we begin to act on keeping the story wider and wider still, always questioning our assumptions, knowing that the story, like us, needs to and can change, both in the telling of it and in the listening to it, to what it means in a certain time and place, and how its themes do or don't change or grow or adapt to new people and places and moments. The impact of stories, both good and bad, linger. It's how things like white supremacy, transphobia, sexism, ageism, classism, and oppressions noticed and named, and those that aren't, keep showing up again and again. It's like the poet writes in today's reading about thistle. Unchecked, they write, it will sprawl over pasture and meadow, choking the sweet grass, defeating the clover. If, unthinking, you grasp it, you will need tweezers to pick out the stickers. They pop open, and parachutes carry their power to disparate venues, which is why there will always be thistle next year. Perhaps that sounds unhopeful. But perhaps in the work of justice, it's just true, which itself can never have a false absolutism either, that somehow we will figure everything out and the world will just be good and we can lay back and enjoy. That is a world built on stories, good or bad, beautiful, broken, all of which will always be part of our story. We can't ignore the histories and stories of oppression and genocide, the stories of hatred and despair when we've made a little progress in certain areas. And neither, if we give our attention to our ancestors, can we ignore the stories of liberation, the stories of resilience right alongside perseverance and widening of the heart and the soul to hold more stories than we knew we could. The ability to tell our own stories, writes Indian activist Arundhati Roy, different than the ones we're being brainwashed to believe. She says another world is not only possible, she is on her way, and on a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. It takes some skill to give your attention to some being so devotedly to hear its breath. It takes some skill to pay attention to someone's story. The kind of skill that Stephanie and Alex shared about how to really listen to, attend to the soul of another human being, another being of any kind in this world, to honor their story different than your own and hear a different world breathing into being. What stories are we telling? And what stories are we breaking open with our vote, with our volunteering, with our everyday work of what we give our time and our attention and resources to? A colleague and activist, a friend of mine, has often said that voting and elections are primarily about harm reduction. This has been helpful framing to me for many reasons. It acknowledges that voting is really an act of faith, not being certain of what will come of it. And even if the vote goes the way of love and justice, it reminds us that elections do matter. They cause or they reduce harm. And at the same time, they do not eliminate all harm. We live in a world, one dominated for millennia by stories of empire, colonialism, of patriarchy and racism and heteronormativity. We know that one election can't, won't fix it, and yet we have to keep singing for our lives. These systems of oppression rise up like thistle right in the midst of this world. When you get close to them and threaten them, they sting hard. And those stories are still there. So perhaps the work now is not waiting for the moment when it's all fixed, but it's grabbing whatever tools we have or whatever tools we're able to learn taking the stories that claim to be the only ones, the ones we're familiar with or too comfortable with as a world, and tearing them open, pushing them wider and wider still until the stories that have been pushed to the margins over and over come to the center. And from that place, we put the book back on the shelf. We back up from the familiar spot. We notice the globe behind us and our little spot, our little place on its turning surface. And we remember that this whole room, our whole lives, are filled with stories. To remember the world has more shelves, more books, more stories than we can possibly imagine. So what are the stories we're living? What are the ones we're telling? What are the ones we're giving our attention to, deeply listening to? What are the ones we're retweeting or sharing or learning from? And from the story being broken open and widened, who do you include when you say we? And what is that story calling us to do next? Somebody's calling my name. It sounds like freedom. Somebody's calling my name. Sounds like justice. Somebody's calling my name. Oh my Lord, what shall I do?